Those of you who've had the patience to bear with us through these 2 days will recall that Barry began the discussion by remarking on an economist and a political scientist wandering into a bar, or more precisely into a deli where these discussions began. And in a sense, it's a perfect place to conclude the 2 days in that we've had a wonderful discussion of the international monetary system that sets up this, an economics discussion of that sets up a more political science discussion of the geopolitics of the transforming financial system. Our presenters today are Abe Newman and Henry Farrell, and the commentator will be Elizabeth Rosenberg. Abe and Henry have together written a very excellent set of materials on weaponized interdependence, how global economic networks shape state coercion, which is rather central to our discussion. Abe is a professor at Georgetown both in the School of Foreign Service and Political Science, the government department as they call it there, and he directs the Mortara Center for International Studies. His collaborator and partner in these things is Henry Farrell, who is the Agora Foundation professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. The commentator, and thank you for joining us, Elizabeth, is Elizabeth Rosenberg, who's a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security program at the Center for New American Security. Her focus over these years is national security, foreign policy, and the implications of the use of sanctions and economic statecraft, which has nothing to do with currency or SWIFT or anything like that at all. With that, let me hand this over to Abe and Henry. I'm not quite sure how you're dividing this up. So in fact, can I let the two of you decide exactly how you want to handle this?
Great. Henry is gonna start talking and I'm going to finish up and I'm going to be the slide projector.
Yep.
There we go. Boom.
Okay, boom. Okay, so weaponized interdependence in a world of fintech. And so what we want to talk about here, we really want to bring the discussion that we've been listening to with enormous interest over the last day and a half, 2 days. We want to bring it more closely into the world of politics and of power. And there have been bits and pieces throughout the last couple of days where we've heard people begin to get into this area. So Barry, for example, just a little while ago was talking about the worries about the weaponization of SWIFT. And what we want to do is to talk a little bit more systematically about how we think about this. So if you think about the standard questions of fintech, in a certain sense, they're the kinds of questions that Brad was talking about yesterday, which is thinking about the world as being an expansion of trust. So you're trying to figure out how can you create the appropriate trust, how can you get consumers to trust in these forms of things, how can you build sort of models which make sure that so when you're looking at the more macro level effects, how do you make sure that there's the trust or confidence, all of these things that you need in order for the system to work. And these are super important. I mean, Abe and I don't for a moment want to say that they're not important, but they're not the only game. And increasingly in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more concern with the question of power. And what we mean to say by this is that these networks, these are not simply just networks that have benefits for consumers, that have all of these benefits in terms of lowering transaction costs and so on. They also have political consequences. And anything that has political consequences or potentially can have political consequences is going to generate some kind of distributional gains. And when we are talking about a world of states, a world in which international institutions still are relatively feeble, we are going to see the temptation for states to begin to think about how these various forms of power can be weaponized. So what we're interested in a sense is how the systems of trust that have been talked about over the last couple of days generate power asymmetries. And if you think about them, so Brad was talking about the Das Gupta's work on trust, and his trust game gives a simple way of thinking about how in a world where there is a power asymmetry, where this may preclude certain kinds of possibilities from happening. And then once these asymmetries come into being, what ways actors are going to use them. And the fundamental notion that we want to start from here is the notion, this shared notion of how it is that the world is connected together by networks of one sort or another. These include trade networks and information networks. And also, as we've discussed over the last couple of days, they include financial networks. They include the financial information networks such as SWIFT, so the dollar clearing system, all of these things which hold the world economy together and allow for money to be transferred readily from one place to another. So then the question becomes, when we have this world which we think about in terms of the benefits that are provided by interdependence, the benefits that these provide in terms of general cooperation, we also see how this interdependent world creates the possibility of coercion, that a country's financial systems become increasingly dependent upon these global networks, and to the extent that they become dependent, and to the extent that other actors are able to see ways to leverage this interdependence, a new kind of power politics can begin. And in our work, as we identify this very simply, we talk about the ways in which it's going to be used for the purposes of global surveillance, that you can use these networks in order to figure out who is talking to who is sending money to who, what kinds of financial transactions are happening, and that can provide you with a crucial degree of strategic advantage. We see this in the world today with financial networks. We also see, and this is something that people like Harold James and his students have discussed, we have seen how this happened in the Britain of the early 20th century, very, very similar dynamics happening. And we also see how this can be potentially used as a choke point. If you are able to effectively gain access to the key nodes in these networks, and these networks, many of the key networks become increasingly centralized over time, you are then able to use potentially control over these nodes as a means of cutting actors out of the global financial system, which can have very, very substantial repercussions for their economies. And so this then suggests that we need to start paying attention to the underlying dynamics in order to understand how it is that financial systems are likely to evolve over time, because these strategic considerations are becoming increasingly important. And the fundamental questions are, what are the central nodes in the network? What are the key networks? What are the places where the control could be seized? And which states have potentially the power to seize them? So we talk about this, we have a lot of discussion in our various articles on this, how it is that financial networks, for example, they form around key hubs that centralize exchange. You can see this with the dollar clearing system very clearly, how the dollar clearing system depends in a crucial way on a very small number of financial institutions, which are all exposed to the power of US regulators, and that this then provides for coercive power for states. In this case, we can see how the dollar clearing system provides an extraordinary degree of ability of the United States to threaten financial actors with exclusion from the dollar clearing system, and hence from the ability to work as an international bank if they do not fulfill certain policy aims that the United States has. So we think that this is going to have key consequences for fintech. And we want to focus in the presentation on how geopolitics is reshaping financial networks, what kinds of consequences it is having. We will do this by talking a little bit about history, and we will talk about how fintech could possibly respond. What kinds of dynamics do we expect to be unleashed as a result of disagreements between states and the providers of these various financial technologies, and what kinds of things might happen as states themselves become actors in the fintech space. So we can see a lot of this if we look at the case of SWIFT, which I think is a case that most of us are reasonably familiar with. When we give presentations, we very often have to get into the details of SWIFT, which until relatively recently used to be a relatively obscure organization people didn't pay much attention to, but which plays a central role, as we all know, in the global financial system. SWIFT financial messaging is what allows key parts of the global financial system to tick over. It is what facilitates a wide variety of financial transfers across states. Now this, for a long time, SWIFT was very, very careful to portray itself in entirely neutral and technical and non-political terms. It sought quite deliberately as a strategy to insulate itself from politics and to refuse requests from the United States or from other actors to use the information and use the network that it ran as a way of providing the United States with means of pursuing certain kinds of policy goals. Next slide. That, however, changed, and it all changed after September 11th. We saw Lenny Schrank, the then CEO of SWIFT, quickly recognize that it was going to be, that this position of it being apolitical was no longer one that it could be maintained. And the United States began to get access to SWIFT under a secret program which allowed it direct access to large tranches of SWIFT information. This provided the United States with an extraordinary panopticon of what was happening globally, especially as the United States kept this program secret. The program was in conflict with European privacy law, which led to a variety of problems when the program was discovered. But initially, this provided the United States with an extraordinary treasure trove of data, which it used in order to try and figure out terrorist networks, which it used in order to try and figure out the ways in which a number of adversaries were using the financial system in order to try and achieve aims which the United States did not want to see. Schumpeter says somewhere or another that the budget is the soul of the state, and I think similarly you can see SWIFT as being the soul of the global financial system, and if you are able to examine the soul, who knows what kinds of secrets it might provide. And this was something which the United States viewed as being a crucial strategic asset, and one which it sought to preserve against all possible political costs. It also began to use this after the role of the United States in SWIFT had come out. It started to use this as a global choke point. And we saw this happening most obviously with respect to Iran in the efforts of the United States under the Obama administration to try and cut Iran out of the financial system in order to try and get it to make concessions on its nuclear program. And here SWIFT found itself being blocked in, not just by US pressure, but also by European pressure, the two in combination, looking to impose sanctions on Iranian financial institutions and looking to SWIFT to impose these sanctions together with control of the dollar clearing system, having a very substantial impact on Iran's ability to pay for, to get paid for the oil and other exports it was making. And this, of course, becomes one of the things that Iran sees as being an urgent negotiating priority, that it is prepared to make substantial concessions on its nuclear program in order to be readmitted into the global financial system. Okay, this is where I leave off, and this is where Abe continues.
Thanks, Henry. And everybody, I was controlling the slides there. And so that's like the ultimate co-author power. You're like, keep going, keep going. Okay, so I think in the second part of the talk, what we want to think about are what are the implications of this argument that we presented on weaponized interdependence for fintech. And I think, you know, our underlying argument is that the plumbing, the back end, it has more than just cooperation or, you know, solving collective action problems, but it also has these distributional consequences. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about here is a little bit more speculation because it depends on the structure of the networks, but we're going to play out a few different scenarios, and really they all point to the same thing, which is that fintech has the potential to have very important geostrategic implications, and so policymakers should think about it accordingly. So the first, which probably you got from our argument about that these financial networks are like a panopticon, is that you have to think about the surveillance and legibility function of fintech type operations or digital currencies. And what I want to stress is that this is not just a privacy argument. So a lot of the arguments about fintech have been embedded in a national conversation of how do you provide secure information for your national citizens. But ultimately, these networks, these financial networks, are transnational, they're global. And that means that you know, intelligence agencies across the globe They want access to them. What we saw in the Snowden revelations in those documents is that the NSA, but also British colleagues and German colleagues, they're all trying to get into these financial systems. So the central nodes of a digital currency or of a fintech operation will have really important implications for how national security agencies have access to information that they're going to use for surveillance operations. And so we think that you have to think about not just national conversation of privacy, but these transnational surveillance questions. And there, I think the current debate between the United States and the EU over the Schrems decision is really important, because if we can't solve that nut, it's going to be very difficult to for us to work together in that space going forward. The second is how do fintech or these digital currencies redistribute choke points in the global economic system? And I don't think this is a very complicated argument to make, but if we see movement, as there was that debate in the last presentation, if China's renminbi, a digital renminbi, starts to be ascendant, you could think of different places or different power potential that China would have to exert choke points rather than the United States. Okay, with those two in mind, the surveillance function and the choke point function, we want to go through just a few different potential scenarios. So the first is really to just unpack this conversation about the United States versus China. And what we would like to put in opposition is not a digital US currency versus a digital Chinese currency, but instead think about a digital US currency versus Chinese platform companies that are doing fintech operations, and how those two things maybe create different geopolitical implications that should be on everybody's mind. So the first is kind of extending on Barry's conversation, which was what happens if you get a digital dollar that really has an extraordinary network effect, that it entrenches the dollar as a hegemonic position in global currencies. Ultimately, if you're going to do trades that go through US dollar facilities like a digital central bank, or if you're using digital dollars, you're going to be touching on this large central position of the United States, and it could reinforce this position. Now, as we kind of talked about earlier, this would only increase the US's ability to both surveil and exclude actors from global operations if they had this kind of, let's say, network effect optimizer. So the second scenario is kind of the opposite, or these don't actually, I think they're probably they have tensions with each other. And that is one where you get Chinese platform companies that chip away at the dollar centrality. Now, here, I think what we would agree with Barry that it's unlikely that a digital renminbi, or just the renminbi in general, would be able to challenge the US dollar head on. But instead, what you're seeing is the way that platforms or fintech operations that are based in China create dark spaces or alternative zones where the dollar becomes less and less important. And here you saw Jack Liu talk about this. He wasn't talking about Chinese platforms, but he was just worried about the US overuse of sanctions. And he said, the plumbing is being built and tested to work around the United States. And over time, as those tools are perfected, if the United States stays on a path where it is seen as going it alone, there will increasingly be alternatives that will chip away at the centrality of the United States. And here, if you take the case of Ant Financial, I think that's exactly the challenge that it and other Chinese-based platform financial companies present, is that you could get these areas where the plumbing isn't based around payment systems that are held by US companies or US firms, but that could be held by Chinese firms. And that you could then have a threat to the US ability to exert surveillance power or choke point power. Now, you could say that's great, because who wants the United States to be in charge of these things anyway? But I think it comes back to the question of who would gain that power. And we know that if the networks are constructed in a way where they have some access by the Chinese government, then they would then increasingly have the ability to either surveil those using those technologies or to exclude groups that are a threat to them. But here, I think what we're worried about is not a direct challenge to the U.S., the position of the U.S. dollar, but rather kind of I don't even think of it as a splinter net. I think Chinese companies, Chinese firms would still be using dollars, but they could then have alternative spaces where they would be based in these platform opportunities. And here, I think, if this was at the end of last week, the Trump administration is already trying to target Ant Financial because I think they see this threat. And this isn't just a commercial threat or a threat based in standards, whether Ant Financial could create some financial crisis, but it's rather that they see this in geostrategic terms in the way that these kinds of platform companies will amass both data, but also be able to exclude actors that maybe are adversaries. Okay, so that was the first kind of scenario, is these two, whether you get a rising digital US currency or rising Chinese platforms. The other thing that we want to just talk about is the restructuring of private actor networks. And here, what we mean by this is if you get a digital central bank currency or a set of platform companies that rise, what will happen to the way the networks that provide global finance, how they change? And one of the things that Barry hinted at, also there was a BIS report that John distributed to me, but now I realize I'm not sure everybody got it. But one of the things that came out in that report was the demise of correspondent banking. This is the network in which actors who want to use US dollar facilities, they rely on correspondent banks to make those trades happen. And if you had a US digital currency, maybe you don't need those correspondent banks anymore. Well, that would have very important implications for the kind of geostrategic implication of this new network. If you didn't have correspondent banks, but you were acting directly with the US Treasury, or the US Fed, then the person that's exerting power is the Fed. It's no longer a secondary sanction through, let's say, Deutsche Bank, but it's a direct sanction by the US the provider of that e-currency. And that, I think, has quite important—
you have about 3 or 4 minutes maximum. Okay.
Perfect, we're wrapping up. So I think that has very large implications for the legitimacy of using these types of power when you're not hiding behind these private actor networks, but instead the US government would be the primary actor of exerting this type of coercion. So let me just wrap up and kind of emphasize what we've said so far. So we think that there's going to be a geopolitics over kind of fintech or digital currencies that will be based in this question of how does it reshape the power of the main actors. So the United States, I think, is already undermining its legitimacy by weaponizing finance generally. But there's then this question of, would you be okay with that shift of power from the United States to Chinese platforms? And if you look in another space in information technology, you see this exact problem playing out in 5G. The question of Huawei and what it means, this isn't just a question about who's going to build a telephone line. This is a question of who is going to have the power to surveil and also choke you off of a network. And there it becomes a question of, well, do you trust the United States and Snowden, or are you more worried about China and its firms? And I think if you don't consider the geopolitical aspects, then we're going to really be, we're going to generate a lot of policy bad consequences going forward. And the 5G case is a great example where this was kind of, pushed under the rug, and now it's all coming to a head. I think the last kind of points are just to emphasize we need to understand the structure of the networks that are evolving and where government jurisdiction intersects with them. I think when we had the conversation yesterday from Ripple, it's a blockchain technology, it's distributed, but ultimately they have to comply with know your customer rules. They have to comply with the jurisdictional rules of the major players. And so many of the kind of coercive potential that we outline is still going to happen, even though the network might be potentially more decentralized. And finally, we'd just like to emphasize that there needs to be a strategic understanding by policymakers of the interaction between fintech and the kind of weaponized interdependence dynamics that we outlined here. And with that, I'll stop.
Remarkable, exactly at 20 minutes. So thank you, Abe. Thank you, Henry. Well done. Elizabeth, may I turn the floor over to you, please?
Yes, there we go. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all and to participate in this really interesting session. I have learned a lot over yesterday and today, and I will attempt now to offer you something useful to think about. I realize that I'm the last speaker in the last session on the last day, and the only thing separating some of you from lunch or bedtime, depending on where you are. So I'm going to do my best here. I want to just start by thanking Abe and Henry for giving me, as always, something really interesting to respond to. Always a pleasure. And I have appreciated how you have brought in a specific consideration of fintech into your broader line of thinking about weaponized interdependence. And you won't be surprised to know that I have some thoughts here, particularly on when it comes to the nature of your US jurisdiction and how broad and expansive, surprisingly so, that will continue to be even in a kind of regionalization or direct relationship, say, between the US Fed and end users anywhere they are in the rest of the world, removing the, the intermediation of banks wherever they are. So let me also just affirm your notion that you've laid out in your broader work on weaponized interdependence about economic networks forming key hubs that centralize exchanges, and that the United States, of course, has amassed quite a lot of important hubs in this economic and financial domain, and most significant among them, perhaps for our purposes today, is when you mentioned the clearing of almost all dollars through a handful of major money center banks in New York, or extrapolating a world of a US central bank digital currency, the clearing, of course, or the tie back to the Fed. Other significant US hubs, or as I tend to think of them, powerful sources of leverage or concentration of economic influence exist, as you all well know, in some areas of trade and supply chains tied to high value, IP intensive tech components. And there were some great points in the last session that really got at that. I want to make three points about implications for international relations in my comments today. And the first is that the weaponizing of these hubs through incumbent financial institutions and fiat currency, or in pushing into some of the fiat, new financial technology domains that we're moving into these days, has become utterly mainstream in US foreign policy in the last few years, to state the obvious here. And we see national security makers leveraging these hubs or economic power concentrations more aggressively, more often, and to serve more purposes. And I would like to suggest that other countries are following and will follow more. And it will look different, of course, than the United States, because their economic power and leverage, or their hubs, both in the nature of what they are and their relative size, is different. But many are studying how they can leverage this power concentrations. And for many countries, just to say that it looks more like creating access restrictions around critical minerals or high-tech areas are fruitful hubs to weaponize, more so than finance, although of course it's not true, and it depends on the nature of the financial institutions and liquidity and the hubs in their jurisdiction. But I want to unpack this a little bit in the US context, because this conversation wouldn't be fun if we didn't bring a little bit of the politics of the day into it. And actually, I'm very impressed at how people have kept this out of the conversation over the last 2 days. Maybe you're all just as fatigued as I am by this, but just to go there. We have seen this proliferation in sanctions and, just to name them here, national security tariffs, export controls, actually significantly in export controls. Let us not be distracted by a discussion of sanctions, actually, when it looks to me like the major proliferation is on trade restrictions around exports, but also restrictions on inbound investments, that's CFIUS in shorthand, and also restrictions on imports. And they're tied to this widening array of US foreign policy priorities. We heard about isolating and pressuring Iran, also Venezuela, Nicaragua, Belarus, and Lukashenko, other countries, financial and economic restrictions targeting proliferation, narco trafficking, terrorism, organized crime, human rights abuse, corruption, cyber intrusion, election interference, suppression of human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and this list goes on and on. And we are seeing that the United States is going after more systemically significant economic targets that are more integrated into the very broad US dollar system, which is to say where there is a US nexus that reaches really far, farther even than practitioners imposing these restrictions thought of them or interpreted them to go 5 and 10 years ago. And whereas Iran was this focus of a kind of weaponized system, and we're talking about the SWIFT example here, was so prominent from 2012 to 2015, and when it comes to Iran, back again in 2018, the model or paradigm over the last 6 years or so, and the last 2 in particular, is moving much more towards targeting China and Russia, and then China. So this has all the trappings of this domain being a major site for geopolitical competition between power rivals. Again, stating the obvious here. And notwithstanding the concerns that observers voiced from 3 to 5 years ago and still do today, we just heard this from, I think, Abe, you said it in the second half of your presentation, about the potential for unwinding the network effect of US financial power from overusing these financial restrictions or banking restrictions. Actually, what we've seen, and this has been well covered by many of you in your presentation so far, so I won't go through it in any detail, but the US financial power and the dollar has quite significant staying power and looks to for quite some time. And we've actually sort of run a couple of natural experiments when it comes to this, the theory or anxiety about diminishing dollar preeminence or US financial strength from overusing these tools by looking at, or rather by running through these, the most recent reimposition of all sanctions on Iran and more, as well as sanctions on individuals in Hong Kong and the new authorities brought to us by the US Congress to impose financial sanctions on Hong Kong, or rather sanctions on Hong Kong financial institutions linked to those people named under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And of course, Hong Kong is a significant financial center. This is a whole different kind of weaponization. This looks nothing, it makes sort of Iran example look like child's play by comparison. And a takeaway from looking at this is that the dollar looks quite strong. That in fact, this dissatisfaction and frustration has not, really does nothing, nothing meaningful to have shaken that. And furthermore, that the long-term stated desire of the Chinese and the Russians and more recently the Europeans to try and get out from under US sanctions and tariffs and other sort of measures, these economic measures, by shifting away from the dollar, it's not enough of a behavioral economic driver to do that. So for better or for worse, it looks like whoever the next administration will be, will have quite a runway to keep weaponizing its financial and economic nodes to advance US policy interests. And just to say, the jurisdiction here is being defined broader and broader and broader. And actually, I think there's real laboratory experimentation going on conducted by the Commerce Department, actually more so than Treasury, because interestingly, Secretary Mnuchin seems to be unwilling to lean in too hard on this. But in commerce, there's a real testing of just how far we can consider US jurisdiction as reaching, how far into, for example, the Chinese telecom industry, we can see this pushing this US jurisdiction, just by way of example.
Liz, you're coming up on 10 minutes, so.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that I don't see fintech developments really upending much source of this leverage. And even when I think it looks like we'll see quite meaningful redistribution and change, redistribution of concentration and change at the retail service level. I see this much less so for major cross-border bank financial flows, which means that there's a real sticky leverage for major global banks or money center banks and the way they do business, which gives US banks, and again, the power of the dollar and the ability to weaponize this, a lot of influence in the future, even if it swings digital. So I'd welcome a conversation with all of you on thinking about how the United States and China, so just want to put this out there to close, 2 quick thoughts, how the United States and China will act more and more in the future using their nodes, their leverage points to engage in competition directly. We've seen this, I'm glad we brought up the example of Ant, both in the rejection of its purchase of MoneyGram in 2018, as well as this new reporting about possibly adding Ant to the commerce entity list, which would have broad scale restrictions on severing US connectivity and financial connectivity and provision of services to Ant. And to close, I wanted to just come back to somewhere where we started the conversation yesterday and thinking about what makes a currency system, a financial system successful. And one of my takeaways was that it's not actually who develops first or necessarily who has the most innovative token or technology, but the one that captures the values of the society and sustains its trust. And in the present moment, bearing in mind what we've heard from Abe and Henry about the potential for surveillance and legibility and how that has already been recognized by the United States and acted upon in policy as a national security threat, what does that mean about the value that policymakers in the United States and elsewhere will place on issues like surveillance or privacy or consumer protection or anti-money laundering in the financial governance, the custodianship that they have going forward of this financial system and the way in which they choose to weaponize it to in fact sever connectivity, regionalize it, as was discussed in the last session. So I'll end it there. Thank you.